My name is Raymond Doyle. I'm 74 years old, and until very recently, I lived in a house I paid for with every dime I earned across 4 decades of honest work. I was a city sanitation engineer, which is a fancy way of saying I drove the garbage truck. For 39 years, I got up before dawn, drank my coffee in silence, and headed out into every kind of weather to do a job few people respected but everyone relied on. When I retired, the city didn't throw a party. They handed me a plaque that someone spelled my name wrong on. I laughed anyway. I was just glad to make it out alive. When my wife, Marion, passed away in 2015 after a brutal bout of pancreatic cancer, the house suddenly felt like a mausoleum. Every creak in the wood, every smell of furniture polish and lavender soap reminded me of her. We had built a life there, raised our daughter Kristen, celebrated birthdays, decorated that old banister for Christmas every single year, no matter how crooked it leaned. After Marion died, that house turned into a museum of silence, and I was its only guest. Kristen started visiting more frequently after the funeral. She brought over casseroles I didn't ask for and looked around the house with the same expression a realtor might wear, as if evaluating the resale value of the furniture. Her husband Patrick was always polite but distant, a man who talked to me as though he was giving a customer service apology for an airline delay. "Mr. Doyle," he called me, even after I told him a dozen times to just say Ray. Their visits became regular, and when Kristen suggested moving in with me for a while so they could save for a down payment on their own place, I agreed. I was lonely, and I missed the sound of people in the kitchen. She said it would be temporary. 6 months, tops. That was 3.5 years ago. In the beginning, it felt almost like a second chance at family. They took the upstairs bedroom, and I kept my space downstairs. Patrick fixed the front steps and repainted the porch. Kristen cooked dinner a few nights a week. We played cards after dinner, just like Marion and I used to. But slowly, the tone changed. Patrick started referring to the house as our place. Kristen talked about remodeling her kitchen. They began moving my things. Marion's piano was quietly relocated to the garage for space. Family photos came down from the hallway. My old recliner was replaced with some beige monstrosity Kristen said matched the aesthetic. I didn't fight them. I didn't want to be difficult. I thought maybe this is what co-living looks like, compromise. Then came the subtle erasure of my routines. I had always kept the garden, tomatoes, squash, even a stubborn patch of rhubarb. One day I came home from an errand to find the soil dug up and replaced with patio tiles. Kristen wanted a space for outdoor entertaining. My books were boxed up and moved into the attic. My tools disappeared from the shed. Patrick claimed he was reorganizing. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, a guest with no keys, no privacy, and no authority. I still paid the property taxes. The deed was still in my name. I still knew the creaks in the floor and which faucet squeaked. But none of that seemed to matter. Over time, they started referring to me in the third person when guests came over. "That's my dad. He stays with us." As if I were a distant uncle they'd taken in out of charity. I ate dinner in silence most nights, nodding along to conversations I wasn't invited into. I stayed out of their way, retreating to my downstairs room like a tenant afraid of making noise. My granddaughter Chloe used to visit. She's Patrick's child from a previous marriage. Sweet girl, about 19 now. She used to sit beside me and listen to my stories about the city, ask about Marion, laugh at my jokes even when they weren't funny. But over the past year, her visits dried up. Kristen said she was busy with school. I didn't pry. You learn not to expect much when you're old. The world shrinks around you. First your friends die off, then your neighbors move away, then even your own voice seems to echo like it's bouncing off the walls of a museum nobody visits anymore. There were small kindnesses. Chloe once left a birthday card on my nightstand, with a hand-drawn picture of the two of us fishing. Even though I hadn't held a rod in 20 years, I kept that card. It felt like proof that I wasn't entirely invisible. But otherwise, the house grew colder. Not literally, Kristen kept the thermostat locked at 72, but emotionally. There was no warmth, no humor, no joy, just quiet efficiency. They had structured the house the way a business runs an office, tidy, minimal, impersonal. I tried to speak up once. It was after they removed the wind chimes Marion had hung on the porch. Little copper bells that made the most delicate music in the breeze. Patrick said the sound annoyed him during conference calls. I said, "That was Marion's favorite thing." He said, "It's just noise, Ray." I wanted to shout, to demand they put them back, but instead I nodded and went inside. I began taking long walks just to be out of the house. There was a trail near the lake where ducks congregated and children fed them bread. I'd bring a thermos of coffee, sit on the bench, and imagine a version of my life where things had gone differently, where Kristen had married a man who respected me, where I still had my chair and my books and my dignity. I imagined Marion sitting beside me, offering her quiet wisdom the way she always had. "Ray," she'd say, "don't let them steal your peace." But peace was hard to come by. One evening I came back from my walk and found the front door locked. My key no longer worked. I knocked. No answer. I rang the bell, waited. I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe they had upgraded the locks and forgotten to tell me. But when I walked around back, I found a cardboard box with my belongings. Slippers, razor, medications, even my photo of Marion, placed carefully but unmistakably on the porch swing. Taped to the front of the box was a note written in Kristen's handwriting. "Dad, we love you, but this situation isn't working anymore. You need space and care we can't provide. We'll help you find a place. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." No key, no explanation, no warning, just a note, neat, cold, and final. At first I stood there in disbelief, gripping the brass doorknob as though I could turn it by sheer force of memory. This was my house. I had paid every mortgage bill. I had shoveled every ounce of snow off that driveway for 30 winters. I had painted the living room walls in the shade Marion picked out just before her diagnosis. I had built the planter box on the porch with my own 2 hands, nailing every board, sealing every seam. And yet, there I was, locked out like a trespasser, reduced to a man reading a note taped to a box, as if the past 50 years of my life were a worn-out library book being returned without a thank you. It didn't register fully. My mind, always slow to anger but trained to search for reason, tried to patch the holes. Maybe it was a miscommunication. Maybe Kristen meant I'd be gone for a weekend, a trial run at some assisted living place. That must be it. Maybe the locksmith came by accident. Maybe the new key was in the box. I dug through it hoping to find one. Nothing. No key, no contact information, not even a phone charger. Just my essentials and that polite, poisonous note. I sat down on the porch swing, the same one Marion and I had sat on countless summer nights with iced tea in our hands and the soft sounds of traffic in the distance. My breath came shallow, more from confusion than panic. I took out my phone, hands trembling more than I'd like to admit, and dialed Kristen. It rang once, then clicked to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. I texted, "Kristen, I'm at the house. The locks are changed. Please call me." I waited. 10 minutes passed. No reply. I texted again. "Is this a mistake?" Still nothing. I called Patrick next. The line went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What could I even say? Hi, I'm sitting outside my own home with my socks stuffed into a cardboard box, just wondering if I've been formally evicted from the family. I sat there for over an hour, watching as the sun dipped lower, casting long, sharp shadows across the lawn I once mowed with precision. I watched neighbors walk by with their dogs. A few recognized me, offered polite waves, but no one stopped. I must have looked like some absent-minded pensioner who had misplaced his keys, a harmless cliché, invisible by design. Eventually, the porch light flicked on automatically. I knew it was timed for Kristen's arrival from work. That realization twisted the knife deeper. They had planned this. It wasn't an impulsive act of frustration. The boxes, the locks, the note, the timing, all of it rehearsed and coordinated. I was no longer a man they couldn't tolerate. I was a problem they had solved. I couldn't bring myself to sleep on the porch. My pride, what little I had left, refused to allow it. I gathered the box in my arms and walked down the street toward the small park with the bench overlooking the duck pond. It wasn't shelter, but it was familiar. I sat down, holding the box between my knees like a child with his lunch pail, and tried again to call Kristen. This time, her phone was off. It didn't just ring, it cut immediately to voicemail. That detail changed something inside me. It told me she had seen my calls and deliberately silenced them. I thought about going to the police, reporting it. But what would I say? That my daughter kicked me out of my own house, despite it being in my name? They'd ask for proof. I had the deed, somewhere in my filing cabinet. Inside the house. Behind a door now guarded by a lock I had no key to. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so humiliating. I thought about calling my old co-worker Wayne, the closest thing I had to a friend these days. But it was nearly midnight, and Wayne had a bad hip and a wife with dementia. I couldn't bring myself to be one more burden on someone who already carried too much. So I sat there until the cold became too much for my joints, then walked the 4 blocks to a 24-hour diner I remembered from years past. Inside, it smelled like scorched coffee and fryer grease. Not unpleasant, just honest. I ordered a slice of pie and a black coffee, mostly so they'd let me sit without questioning my presence. The waitress was young, early 20s maybe, with tired eyes and chipped nail polish. She placed the coffee in front of me and smiled politely, but didn't make small talk. I was grateful for that. The quiet helped. It gave my thoughts room to move. I tried to think clearly, to separate emotion from fact. Kristen and Patrick had locked me out. They left a note, vague but pointed. They had no legal right, not unless I had unknowingly signed something over. But I knew I hadn't. I remembered the last time I looked at the deed. Marion had underlined our names in blue pen and written, "Our home forever," in the margin. Sentimentality, maybe, but also clarity. I stayed in that diner until nearly dawn. When the sky began to brighten, I walked back towards the house. The lawn sprinklers had come on. Automatic. No sign of movement inside. Curtains drawn. I didn't knock. What was the point? Instead, I walked another 2 miles to the public library. It wasn't open yet, but the benches out front caught the early sun. I sat and thought, not just about what happened, but about how I'd allowed it. I had seen the signs, the dismissiveness, the diminishing space, the soft humiliations, but I'd made excuses. I didn't want to believe my daughter, the child I held in the hospital room, the girl I taught to ride a bike, the woman Marion always said had my eyes, was capable of such casual cruelty. But she was. And now I needed a plan. I spent most of that day in a daze, wandering between the public library and the surrounding blocks, trying to anchor myself in a reality that seemed to have slipped loose from its moorings. The betrayal still felt too fresh to fully comprehend, as if the act of being locked out, of being dispossessed in such a methodical, quiet way, hadn't yet found its emotional weight. It was too surreal. My daughter, my only living child, had not only turned her back on me, she had orchestrated my erasure. Not in rage, not in some burst of passion or heat-of-the-moment argument. No, this had been done coldly, efficiently, like someone taking out the trash after cleaning the house. There was no scene, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a lock changed, a box on the porch, and silence. By the time the library opened, I was seated at a terminal trying to remember my log-in credentials for the county records database. Somewhere in there, I had a digital copy of the deed. I fumbled with the keyboard, hands stiff with age and fatigue, until I finally accessed the documents. There it was. My name, clear as day. Raymond Thomas Doyle. Sole owner. No co-signers, no transfers. I stared at the screen, rereading the lines over and over again, letting the truth settle like a warm stone in my gut. They had no right. Whatever moral justifications they whispered to themselves, whatever fantasy they'd conjured about me needing to be looked after or removed for my own good, the law was clear. The house was mine. I printed the documents, stuffed them into a manila folder, and left the library with a sense of fragile purpose. My next stop was the courthouse, where I waited nearly 2 hours in a government office, thick with the smell of old coffee and paper dust. When my number was called, I sat down across from a clerk with a nameplate that read, Amelia Groves. She looked up, blinked slowly behind tortoiseshell glasses, and offered a tired, professional smile. I explained what had happened, that I had been locked out of my own house by my daughter and son-in-law, that I had no access to my own property. I slid the deed across the counter. She studied it, her brow tightening. You're still the listed legal owner, she said, tapping the page gently. Do you have any legal agreement transferring occupancy or power of attorney to them? No, I said, my voice tight. There was never anything signed. They moved in with me after my wife died. I let them stay. That's all. She nodded slowly and handed me a pamphlet. Then technically, you can file for a forcible entry and detainer action. It's not exactly the same as a landlord-tenant dispute, but it applies in situations like this. You'll need to speak with an attorney. I stared at the pamphlet in my lap, the words blurring. I had never sued anyone in my life. The idea of dragging my daughter to court, of putting her on the stand, was repellent, not just because it felt like an admission of failure as a parent, but because it would mean laying bare, in public, the private rot of our family. Still, what choice did I have? As I left the courthouse, I decided to stop by my old neighbor Calvin's house. He and I had shared a fence line for 25 years before he moved to assisted living last year. I knew his son still checked on the place occasionally. Calvin had always kept a spare key to my house, just in case. Maybe, just maybe, it was still somewhere in his old garage. I knocked, explained who I was to Calvin's son, a balding, wary man in his 50s, and asked if the key might still be where we used to hide it, behind the third peg on the old tool wall. To my astonishment, it was. I held that brass key in my palm like a relic, unsure whether to laugh or cry. I didn't tell the son what had happened. I thanked him, walked back to the house, and approached the side entrance as if entering a crime scene. The key turned easily in the lock. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by a strange sensation. Not guilt, not fear, but violation. My own house looked foreign. There were new paintings on the wall, minimalist and sterile. The smell was no longer the soft mixture of lemon polish and dust I had known for decades. Now it smelled like synthetic candles and lavender detergent. I tiptoed through the kitchen, half expecting someone to leap out and accuse me of trespassing. In the living room, my old recliner was gone. In its place was a white, faux leather sofa, spotless and joyless. The bookshelf had been reorganized. My biography of Lincoln, annotated and worn from years of rereading, was missing. In its place stood hardcovers with pastel spines and meaningless titles. I went to the hallway closet and found, to my amazement, my box of winter coats shoved behind Patrick's golf clubs, so they hadn't thrown everything out. Not yet. I didn't linger. I didn't go upstairs. I grabbed a few things, my records, a few framed photos of Marion, the jewelry box she kept in the top drawer, the folder of financial papers I'd stored behind the false wall panel in the office, and left. I didn't lock the door behind me. That night, I stayed at a budget motel on the edge of town. It was a drab, carpeted rectangle of a room with a television bolted to the wall and sheets that smelled faintly of bleach. I laid my things on the bed in a neat row and sat in the armchair staring at them. I was 74 years old, a homeowner, a father, a widower, and now, apparently, a man in exile. The next day I made an appointment with a local attorney whose name I found in a phone book at the motel. Her office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian, and her handshake was firm and dry. She listened quietly as I explained the situation, flipping through the deed and the courthouse pamphlet I had collected. When I finished, she nodded once and said, "They're squatting." The word made me wince. Squatters. That's what Kristen and Patrick had become in legal terms. Uninvited occupants refusing to vacate a home they had no ownership in. My daughter, a squatter in her own father's house. She went on to explain the process. A formal demand for possession, followed by a court summons if they didn't comply. It would be public, messy, and likely emotional. They may try to claim you're mentally unfit. She warned, as if reading my thoughts. They may say you're forgetting things, acting irrationally. I'm not, I said. She didn't question it. We'll file the initial notice, then we wait. If they fight it, we prepare for court. If they ignore it, we file for judgment. I signed the papers with a trembling hand. When I left her office, the sun was setting behind a row of low buildings, casting long orange shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my car and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older than I remembered. My eyes were ringed with fatigue, my skin pallid from too much time indoors. But there was something else in my expression now. Not just hurt, not just confusion, but anger. Cold, quiet anger. The kind that doesn't shout or throw things. The kind that waits. The kind that plans. They had locked me out. They had tried to erase me. But they had forgotten one thing. The house was mine, and I was still here. 2 days after I signed the legal demand to reclaim my home, Kristen finally called me. I saw her name flash on the motel phone's caller ID while I was eating a lukewarm bowl of oatmeal, the television buzzing with morning commercials I wasn't really watching. For a second, I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the receiver, but then I picked it up. "Dad?" she began, her voice a strange mixture of forced calm and clipped nerves. "We need to talk." I didn't answer at first. She filled the silence. "Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to throw us out?" There was something so upside down in her tone, as if I were the one who had broken trust, as if my standing up for myself was some kind of betrayal. "Because," I said, keeping my voice even, "it's my house." "You changed the locks. You left me outside. That was your decision." She sighed. "You've been confused lately. You forgot the water on again. You're getting forgetful. Patrick was worried. We just thought—" "Don't." I cut her off. "Don't spin this like it's for my own good." She paused, then dropped her voice to a lower register, the way she used to when she was a teenager trying to manipulate a situation. "Dad, please. If you go through with this, it'll get messy. You don't want that? I don't want that? Let's find a solution quietly. Maybe we can put the house in all 3 of our names and keep living together, but legally this is going to turn into a disaster. You don't want to spend your last years like this." The word last echoed with a nasty finality. I told her we'd let the court decide, and hung up. The next morning, my attorney called to inform me Kristen and Patrick had retained their own lawyer and were now disputing the possession claim. Worse, they'd submitted an informal statement questioning my mental fitness, citing recent memory issues and paranoia. I had expected this. It was the playbook Patrick always carried with him. Gaslight, discredit, and then deny responsibility. But hearing it verbalized, seeing it in print, hit like a cold slap. The lawyer advised me to schedule an independent evaluation to demonstrate cognitive clarity before it escalated further. She said, "If they try to make this a competency case, we shut it down fast." So I did. I made the calls, booked the appointments. Over the next few days I was poked, questioned, tested. They made me recall words, draw clocks, describe historical events. One young doctor, not more than 30, asked me who the president was, then looked surprised when I replied, "Unfortunately, I know." The results came back fast. All normal. No signs of impairment. I forwarded the documents to my lawyer, who attached them to our case. But something had shifted inside me. What kind of daughter tells the world her father is losing his mind to keep his property? One night, back at the motel, I sat flipping through Marion's old jewelry box, the only thing I had managed to grab that still smelled like home. Inside were her keepsakes, the silver locket I bought her on our 20th anniversary, a folded note in her handwriting that simply said, "Come find me under the pear tree. I need 5 more kisses," and a small photograph of me in my younger years, holding Kristen when she was barely 4. I looked at that photo for a long time, studying the child in my arms, the trust in her eyes, the way her hand clung to my collar. I couldn't connect that little girl to the woman now barricaded inside my house, accusing me of delusion. That weekend I went back to the house again, this time accompanied by my lawyer and a local sheriff's deputy. We knocked. Patrick answered, barefoot, wearing an untucked dress shirt and jeans. He looked surprised, but not afraid. Kristen emerged a moment later, pale and tense. "We're serving you with official notice of pending litigation," my attorney said. She handed over the papers and outlined their contents calmly. Kristen took them, glanced briefly, then said, "Dad. Please, we can fix this." I said nothing, just turned and walked back to the car. That night, I couldn't sleep. The motel walls were thin, and the couple next door was arguing about something, muffled, incoherent voices punctuated by sudden silence. I lay awake thinking not about the case, not even about the house, but about the way people disappear from each other slowly. It's never one event. It's a series of tiny moments where someone chooses not to see you, not to ask, not to care. I thought of the Thanksgiving when Kristen didn't come, claiming she had a cold, but later posted pictures of a beach trip online. I thought of the birthday card she forgot 2 years in a row. I thought of how, when Marion died, Kristen hugged me like someone comforting a stranger, not a man who had lost his life's partner. In the morning, I called the bank. I wanted to make sure Kristen had no access to any of my accounts. To my dismay, I discovered an old joint account we had set up when she was in college, a convenience that had never been closed. It was still active. The teller told me that regular withdrawals had been made, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands. "From her?" I asked. "Yes," the woman said. "All digital transfers." I hadn't looked at that account in years. I hadn't even remembered it existed. All that money, gifts, pension trickles, emergency funds, had been drained. Not all at once, over time, quietly. That was the moment everything solidified. I wasn't just being pushed aside, I was being harvested. My love, my trust, my generosity, all reinterpreted as weakness, as an open spigot. And now that I was inconvenient, no longer compliant, I had been cut out like a tumor. I closed the account that afternoon and transferred the remaining balance to my new bank. Then I drove to a nearby senior community I'd read about online, not because I was planning to move, but because I wanted to see what a place for someone like me really meant. The woman at the desk was kind. The hallways smelled like lemon cleaner. The rooms were small but neat, but everything about the place felt like a waiting room for death. And I wasn't ready to sit still. When I got back to the motel that night, there was a voicemail from my lawyer. Kristen and Patrick had replied to the court notice. They were refusing to vacate. The case would go to hearing. "They're digging in," she said. "This is going to get uglier before it gets better." I stood at the window, looking out over the parking lot at the flickering neon vacancy sign. It wasn't the cold air that made me shiver. It was the realization that this wasn't just a family dispute. This was a siege, and I was the one under attack. The week leading up to the court hearing passed like a long, slow-motion collapse. Not explosive, not dramatic, but silent and suffocating, like the weight of a ceiling lowering inch by inch. Each day, I waited for another shoe to drop, another betrayal to surface, another reminder that what I had thought was family had become something colder, more calculated. My lawyer prepared everything meticulously. She gathered documentation, the deed, the cognitive assessment, even photos of the house before and after Kristen and Patrick moved in. Photos that showed the subtle erasure of my life, of Marion's touch, of the things we had built. I gave her access to bank statements, to letters, even to old emails I'd forgotten existed. She said the more context, the better. But what she didn't say, and what I understood on my own, was that we were not just preparing a case, we were building a portrait of a man who had been slowly, carefully removed from his own story. 3 days before the hearing, I received a letter. It was hand-delivered to the front desk of the motel by a courier in a Navy windbreaker. It was from Kristen's lawyer, a formal request for mediation. Inside the envelope was a typed letter offering what they called a reasonable compromise. Kristen and Patrick would agree to vacate the house voluntarily if I transferred 50% of the property's value to them within 6 months, either by sale or refinancing. The letter described their contributions to the home, cosmetic upgrades, repairs, maintenance, as justification for partial ownership. I stared at the words for a long time, and then I laughed. I laughed so hard the woman behind the motel counter asked if I was okay. 50%. For replacing my curtains. For repainting the hallway. For moving my wife's piano to the garage and calling it feng shui. I had paid every cent of that mortgage. I had worked 50-hour weeks in winter and summer, through blizzards and heat waves, missed birthdays and holidays, to make sure that house was ours, mine and Marion's. Kristen had contributed nothing but complaints and entitlement, and now she wanted a payout for the privilege of betraying me. I refused mediation. My lawyer filed the response immediately, citing bad faith and attempted coercion. The next blow came quietly but sharply. That Friday morning, I tried using my credit card to pay for breakfast and was told it had been declined. I called the bank. After a long wait, a representative told me that a fraud alert had been placed on the account. Apparently someone had reported unusual activity. A hold was placed until verification. I asked who filed the report. It was flagged through a family-linked fraud notice, the woman said hesitantly. It looks like someone named Kristen Doyle submitted the concern. My voice didn't rise. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the plastic card in my hand. This wasn't a war over property anymore. This was a campaign of slow attrition. They were trying to choke me out, dollar by dollar, paper by paper. I spent the day restoring my financial access. I reopened my credit line with new credentials. I pulled every dollar out of the old bank, closed every account Kristen might have ever touched or even seen. I secured my pension, rerouted my mail, and created a list of every single institution that had ever had my contact information, and I scrubbed her from every one of them. I felt less like a father and more like a man in witness protection. That weekend, while reviewing documents for court, I found something I hadn't remembered in years. It was an old email chain from 10 years ago between Marion and Kristen. I don't know why I had printed it, but there it was, buried in a folder labeled Home Repairs. Marion had written, gently but firmly, asking Kristen to please be more respectful during visits, to let your father have his quiet in the mornings, and to understand that this house is not your staging ground. Kristen's reply was curt, dismissive. Dad's always grumpy. Maybe if he learned to communicate like an adult, we wouldn't feel like intruders. I stared at the page. Even back then, she had seen me not as a man grieving the loss of his energy and youth, but as a problem to be solved. It was like finding a photograph of rot underneath paint. Undeniable proof that something had been broken long before I noticed it. Monday arrived. The hearing was set for 10 a.m. at the King County Courthouse. I wore my best suit, the one Marion bought me 10 years ago for our niece's wedding. It hung loose around the shoulders now, but I pressed it the night before and polished my shoes until they shone. I wanted no one in that courtroom to see a frail old man. I wanted them to see someone who still stood tall. Kristen and Patrick were already seated when I entered. She wore a grey dress and a blue scarf, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the lines of her face. Patrick sat beside her in a fitted blazer, eyes forward, mouth tight. Their lawyer, a smug man in his 40s with 2 white teeth, looked at me as though I were a patient in a nursing home who'd wandered into the wrong building. The judge was a tall woman with grey streaked hair and a voice like polished wood. She asked for opening statements. My lawyer went first, laying out the timeline with precision: the ownership deed, the absence of rental agreement, the lockout, the financial trail. She handed over the cognitive test results, the banking records, even the photos of me sitting outside the house with my box of belongings. This, she concluded, is not a man in need of protection. This is a man whose kindness has been weaponized against him. Kristen's lawyer began his rebuttal with a deep breath, as though preparing to perform. He described a narrative of concern, that Kristen and Patrick had moved in to care for a grieving parent, that over time Raymond had become increasingly erratic, that he had forgotten to turn off the stove, left water running, wandered the neighborhood at night. He spoke of late-night calls from worried neighbors, of medication bottles found open, of an incident involving missing money. I sat there listening, barely breathing, as lie upon lie was stacked like bricks. Then came the line that stuck in my ribs like a blade. It is our position that Mr. Doyle should be evaluated for guardianship placement, and that until such time, his request to evict his caregivers should be denied. The judge blinked. Guardianship? She asked, her voice clipped. Has any such petition been filed? Not yet, the lawyer admitted, but we believe the court should consider it as relevant context. My lawyer rose like a fire alarm. Your Honor, we have already submitted independent medical evaluations proving full cognitive competence. This is a transparent attempt to cloud the issue. The judge nodded, made notes, then asked Kristen to speak. She stood slowly, hands clasped in front of her, like she was auditioning for a sympathy award. My dad has always been difficult, she began. He's stubborn. He doesn't listen. We just wanted what was best for him. Her voice cracked slightly, well-timed. He's been so isolated since Mom died. We thought we could help him, but he changed. He became angry, paranoid. He accused us of stealing when all we did was try to care for him. I sat motionless, not trusting my own breath. Then, to my surprise, The judge turned to me. "Mr. Doyle, would you like to speak?" I stood. My knees shook, but my voice did not. I spent 40 years working for this city. I paid for every brick in that house. My wife died in that house. My daughter moved in with promises of helping, and then she took over, piece by piece. She moved my things. She changed the locks. She took my money. And when I pushed back, she said I was losing my mind. I looked at Kristen then. "You said you wanted what was best for me. But what you really wanted was for me to stop existing, except on paper, except for my money. I gave you everything, and when I had nothing left to give, you tried to erase me." Silence filled the courtroom like a held breath. The judge looked down at her notes for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm granting Mr. Doyle's request. The respondents will have 30 days to vacate the property. Any failure to comply will result in forcible removal and contempt of court." Patrick made a sound, something between a cough and a curse. Kristen's face remained still, but her hands clenched into fists. The hearing ended. I walked out of that courtroom not victorious, not proud, just exhausted. But I had something I hadn't felt in months, solid ground beneath my feet. That night, back at the motel, I sat by the window and watched the traffic glide past on the highway. I thought of Marion. How she would have stood beside me in that courtroom, how she would have held my hand without needing to say a word. And I knew then that this wasn't over. There would be more bitterness, more legal traps, more twisted phone calls. But I had drawn the line. I had reminded them, and myself, that I was still here, that I mattered, that I wouldn't be erased. 3 weeks after the court ruling, I stood once more in front of my house. My house, not a memory, not a legal abstraction, not an address I whispered to lawyers behind glass desks, but a real place with brick and paint and soil I had once turned over with my own hands. The front lawn had gone patchy in my absence. The flower beds now a tangle of withered stems and dry mulch. The porch light had burned out. It was exactly as it should be, neglected, because the people inside had never loved this house, not the way Marion and I did. They didn't treat it like a home. They treated it like leverage, like proof of their grown-up stability. Like something that could be claimed, flipped, upgraded, and passed off as earned. But now the clock was running out. The court had given them 30 days. They had used 29. I had heard nothing from Kristen or Patrick since that hearing. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even another mediation request. Only silence, as if the gravity of their loss had rendered them too stunned to lash out. That silence worried me. It wasn't like Patrick to go down without a scheme. I imagined them frantically making calls, begging friends to take them in, trying to work out some way to contest the order again. But there was nothing left to contest. The judge's words had been final. When I knocked on the door, it was Patrick who answered. He looked different, tired, smaller somehow. His eyes darted past me toward the street as if checking for backup. "She's upstairs packing," he said, voice low. "We're almost out." I nodded once and stepped inside. The air smelled of cardboard and lemon wipes. Boxes were stacked by the door. A few pieces of cheap wall art leaned against the hallway. In the living room, the white sofa was gone, as were the modern lamps Kristen had insisted on. The house looked bare, like a rental stripped for its next tenant. I stood silently, letting the space settle around me, reacquainting myself with the walls and ceilings that had once meant safety. Patrick didn't try to speak again. He moved toward the kitchen and busied himself with something in the sink, pretending I wasn't there. Upstairs I could hear movement, soft thuds, the rustle of bags. Kristen appeared 15 minutes later, her hair down, her eyes red, carrying a suitcase. She froze when she saw me, and for a second we just stared at each other. Not father and daughter, not accuser and defendant, just two people who no longer understood one another. "I left the keys on the counter," she said quietly. "Everything else is packed." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. She looked at me as if waiting for something, anger, triumph, forgiveness. But I gave her none of it. I simply stepped aside so she could pass. When she did, I noticed she carried Marian's old scarf in her hand. I reached out and took it without a word. Kristen didn't resist. They left without slamming the door. Just a dull click behind them, a sound so slight it might have been missed, but to me it was thunder. I waited until I saw their car pull away before I allowed myself to walk through the house. Room by room, I inspected the damage. Not the physical kind, although there was that too. A chipped bathroom sink, scuffed hardwood, a dent in the refrigerator door. But the emotional kind. The closets where Marian's clothes had once hung now held nothing but the scent of detergent and loss. The sunroom, once filled with potted plants and her sewing projects, was empty. They had taken her rocking chair. I stood there in that silence, listening for ghosts. I slept in my own bed that night for the first time in months. It smelled stale, the sheets stiff from disuse, but it was mine. I laid Marian's scarf on the pillow next to me and tried to pretend her warmth was still folded in its threads. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking up with the sunlight on my face and the sound of birds outside, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like exile. It felt like peace. The next morning, I called the realtor. We had spoken once before. A brief conversation about property values, timelines, logistics. Now I was ready. I told her I wanted to sell, not out of spite, not as a final blow, but because the house had been tainted, and I knew it would never again be a place of rest. Too many memories now tangled in hurt. Too many corners I could no longer walk past without flinching. She came that afternoon, took photos, complimented the bones of the place. "It's got a classic layout," she said. "People want that again. You'll get offers quick." I nodded. I didn't tell her that every nail in those walls had once held a piece of my life. A week later, an offer came. Higher than I expected. I accepted. The sale would close within a month. I began to pack, carefully, deliberately, deciding what to keep and what to let go. I took Marian's things, our photo albums, my records, a few books, and the wind chimes they had once removed from the porch. Everything else I donated. It felt like peeling off layers of dead skin. Painful at first, then freeing. 2 days before the movers arrived, I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature. Just a sentence. "You'll die alone in a place that doesn't know your name." I read it once, then again, and then I burned it. I knew it was from Kristen, or Patrick, or both. I knew it was meant to slice into the soft part of my chest where old men keep their fears. But I wasn't afraid. I had already died once, not physically, but spiritually, the night they locked me out. Everything after that had been resurrection. The day I moved, I stood on the porch for a long time, looking out at the neighborhood, at the trees I had planted decades earlier, at the cracks in the pavement I used to fix myself. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I just breathed. And then I left. I didn't tell Kristen my new address. I didn't give her my new phone number. I didn't tell her where the house money went. I bought a small apartment near the coast, with a window that faces the sunrise and enough space for a man and his ghosts. Sometimes, when the air is still and the light hits the ocean just right, I think about what Kristen said in court, about how I had always been difficult, always grumpy, always distant. Maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't the easiest man to love, but I was honest. I was steady. I was hers. And she threw me away because love wasn't useful anymore. I don't hate her. I don't wish her harm. But I know now that not all stories of family end in reunion. Some end in silence. And sometimes, silence is the closest thing to justice we get. It's been 6 months since I last saw Kristen. The silence between us hasn't been broken, not by accident or hesitation or some late-night pang of regret. It sits between us now like a river too wide to cross, and I've stopped standing at the edge. My new apartment is small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen that smells of pine cleaner and salt air, but it's mine. I have a chair by the window where I drink my morning coffee and watch the sea roll in. Some mornings, when the wind shifts just right, I hear the gulls and think of Marion. How she used to say that old birds never cry out unless they know the weather's about to turn. I wonder what kind of storm she would have predicted for us. The neighbours here don't know my story. I'm just the man in 2B who likes his music low and his routine steady. They nod politely in the hallway, offer me cookies at the holidays, invite me to the occasional potluck. I attend when I feel like it. Sometimes I bring my record player and play Sinatra. They smile and say I have good taste. No one asks me why I left my house, why I live alone now, why there's a certain weariness in my posture. And I don't volunteer. I've learned that people will fill in the blanks with stories much softer than the truth. Let them. I've taken up gardening again, on a smaller scale. A few pots on the balcony, tomatoes, basil, a struggling pepper plant that refuses to die. I find satisfaction in watching something grow just because I care for it. There's no one here to move them when I'm not looking, no one to replace them with plastic replicas for the sake of a cleaner visual. It's a small freedom, but it matters. Sometimes I hear from Chloe, Kristen's stepdaughter. She sends me short emails, updates about college, a photo here and there. She never mentions her mother. I don't ask. I told her once, during one of our last real conversations, that she didn't have to choose sides. She said, "I already did, Pop. I just didn't say it out loud." That meant more to me than I let on. In her, I still see something good surviving the wreckage. I haven't filed any charges. I could have. Financial abuse, attempted guardianship fraud, even identity interference. But I didn't. Not because I forgave them, but because I understood that some punishments are heavier when left to settle slowly. Let them carry what they did. Let them feel the cold when the money runs out and there's no hand left to take from. Let them explain to friends why the house is gone, why the story they once told about helping Dad ends in court transcripts. Let silence be the sentence. Let distance do what the law could not. I've started writing things down. Not memoirs, not for publishing, just for myself. A record of what happened, how it felt, what it changed in me. Some pages are raw, some restrained. I don't know if anyone will ever read them. Maybe one day Chloe will. Maybe she'll want to know the truth behind the gaps. Maybe she won't. Either way, I'm writing not to preserve the pain, but to release it. Each sentence is a thread unwound from the knot. I think about Kristen sometimes, but never with longing. Just recognition. A name, a fact, a consequence. I wonder if she ever thinks about me. If she dreams about the house, about the wind chimes, about the night she folded my life into a cardboard box and left it on the porch. Maybe she regrets it. Maybe she doesn't. It no longer changes anything. I don't believe in poetic justice. Life rarely offers symmetry. What I do believe in is endurance, the quiet kind that doesn't shout or break or demand to be noticed, the kind that simply refuses to end. I lived through it. That's enough. And some mornings, when the breeze comes in through the balcony door and the scent of basil mixes with the salt, I remember something Marion once told me. You can survive anything, Ray, as long as you still have a place to sit and a sky to look at. I have both, and for now, that is more than enough.